Okay, friends, so this is the third video lecture on the topic of adolescence, and we're going to carry on talking a little bit more about teenagers and sex. This is a time of rapid sexual development, and it's not uncommon. According to our textbook, it says about half of teenagers have experienced intercourse by the time they get through high school. I no longer have a teenager, so I can't I haven't seen any data to discount this or to say this is not true. The data does indicate, however, that teen pregnancy is down since the early 1990s. But what's also interesting about that is that compared to other industrialized nations, we actually have quite a high teen pregnancy rate. So what that tells us is that our teens are probably as sexually active in the US as they are in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, but the access to contraceptives for teenagers. I have a friend of mine who is from Europe, and she has three teenage girls, and she has been known to complain about how difficult it is to get teenage puberty girls, so girls prior to 16, contraceptives. And her position is that the government should not be telling parents what their children have access to. In terms of if their bodies are sexually mature, then her argument is that they should have access to things like contraceptives. But this is really it's a philosophical issue as well as probably a physical and a social issue. But there are some identifiable risk factors to sex in your teenage years. One is obviously your relationship to your parents. Now, this can be good because you can have an open conversation about sex. It can also be potentially increase the risk of sexual activity if your parents hold permissive, and I don't like the use of that word, but if the parents hold fairly liberal views about sexuality. Another one, as we've talked about in another chapter, is early puberty puts girls at particular risk because they're attractive to older boys. If a child has been exposed to sexual abuse early on, and if they have a teen parent as a role model. So if you know of other teens who are sexually active because young people are influenced by peer groups, this may also put you at risk. There's quite an extensive, not an extensive, but there's a nifty little chart in your book, in your textbook, on contraceptives that range everywhere from injectables to female condoms to male condoms to IUDs to patches. I am going to turn this into a quiz. Suffice it to say, there are way more options today than were available for your parents in terms of contraceptives. I also admit to not being completely up to date on some of the laws about access to contraceptives. Back in the day, when I was in college, you could buy condoms were available in vending machines in the dorms. They were giving them away 10 for $1. I don't know if they're as available. They don't seem to me here in this college, they don't seem as available. Like, come to think of it, I can't think of any place in this building you could get condoms. But when I was in college, you could have gotten them in the dorm, in the office, in the main, yeah, you could have gotten them in the dorm office. You could have gotten them in all kinds of student service buildings across campus. That just occurred to me. There's also a discussion about sexually transmitted infections. Your textbook or we used to call them STDs. Before that, they were venereal diseases, VD, and then they became sexually transmitted diseases, and now they are sexually transmitted infections. Certain groups are at greater risk. You've got, your textbook says young people. I suppose this would be true because young people probably are a little bit more naive, probably less likely to be using contraceptives, gay, bisexual men, and women. So here is a really important thing to know, that despite maybe all of the stereotypes that women are the one giving infections to men, it's actually the other way around. Women are 7 times more likely to contract an infection from a man than a man is from a woman. So let me say that again. Women are 7 times more likely to contract an infection from a man than a man is to get an infection from a woman. And this has to do with their anatomy, with the anatomy differences. A man can be carrying a viral infection or a bacterial infection and be non-symptomatic. so you can't see it. And her body being the way that it is designed, she will contract it. She will be more easy to get an infection from him than the other way around. Really, the only way to prevent any of this is abstinence, but to profess abstinence only to teenagers, I don't think is practical or reasonable. One of the there is some data that says that that young teenagers who have grown up with an attitude of abstinent only, and they have only gotten abstinence only sex education without all the other stuff about how you protect yourself, how to use condoms, how to use dental dams, or even just the knowledge about how common sexually transmitted infections are actually more likely. So let me say this again. If you, young people who are exposed only to abstinence only education are more likely to become pregnant and are more likely to get sexually transmitted infections than young people who learn about STIs, who learn about pregnancy. So while abstinence only educated young people may delay sexual activity, they are less likely to be safe. So we learn about safe sex. We may have sex sooner, but we will have safer sex than if we don't learn about safe sex. I should have said that. That's the simpler way to say it. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit because there's more going on in an adolescent's life than sexual activity. This is a period where teenagers need a lot of sleep, and at least in a lot of communities, the way we have our education, our education system is actually backwards. So in Manhattan, at least where I currently live, the high school starts at 7:40 in the morning and the elementary school starts at 8:40 in the morning. Well, what we know about the sleep patterns is that the natural sleep cycle of a teenager is actually to sleep later in the morning. The natural sleep cycle of a younger child is to get up early in the morning. So we actually have it backwards. We should be starting elementary school earlier and high school later because the natural teenage brain needs 8 to 10 hours, which is actually quite a bit, and they tend to go to become sleepy later in the night and need to sleep earlier. Teenagers need a lot of sleep. They're doing a lot of growth. Right there, it says their slowed growth. I just said, anyway, it doesn't matter. So their bodies are not growing as much. They may or may not need the same amount of calories if they're not physically active. And because young people have more independence, we might start to see a change in their eating habits and their nutrition. I'm thinking about what my daughter ate when she was a high schooler, and it was just atrocious, the things that girl would eat. Just not good for her food. And anytime I would comment, of course, I would get all kinds of pushback. So one of the things that we learn as parents, or we should learn as parents, is not to make a big deal about what our kids eat, because this can also lead to what we would call disordered eating. When there's disordered eating, this isn't really a place for me to spend a whole lot of time about in the context of what we mean by disordered eating, but basically it's when we have an unhealthy relationship with food. What do we mean by an unhealthy relationship with food? We mean when we're using food for something other than nourishment, when we're using food to comfort us, when we're using it as a mechanism to feel some sense of control, when we have an attitude of like good food, bad food. All of those ideas fall under the umbrella of an unhealthy relationship with food. Food is nourishment, and that is probably the healthiest attitude to have. The most common, or when we talk about eating disorders, the three that we're likely to talk about or anorexia nervosa, which is characterized by somebody not maintaining a healthy body weight. So they become, I think that's what this first one is, they become unhealthily thin. They don't consume enough calories. They often have a distorted body image. They look in the mirror, they see themselves as fat, even though they're all skin and bones. So anorexia nervosa is below body weight. Bulimia nervosa is one where we binge and purge. So a person may look like a normal body weight, but as a strategy. And I don't want to really get into all of the disordered thinking, but it's not uncommon for somebody who has bulimia to use food as a way of control. So they'll eat a lot, they'll binge, and then they'll purge, they'll throw up. The physical risk factors of bulimia nervosa are things like rotten teeth from throwing up all the time. It starts to all of the bile from one's stomach starts to cause damage to the throat and the esophagus, these kinds of things. They also look like a normal weight on the outside. And then another one that showed up in the textbooks a few years back is binge eating disorder. And this is characterized by eating large quantities of food and potentially feeling guilt about it, but not with the purge. So we may eat like a whole gallon of ice cream or a whole bag of chips and then feel all kinds of regret, feel terrible about that, but don't seem to have any control. So there are some risk factors, some explanations. We've got genes because these are thought to be disordered thinking, which can be attributed to brain structures that we potentially inherited. We have some social and some psychological factors. Obviously, we're not going to have binge eating in a community, in a culture that doesn't have access to food that you can binge on, and we're probably not going to have anorexia in a culture that doesn't value thinness. So there's some cultural elements here. And then these are usually considered comorbid, which means they are usually that this is one example of disordered thinking that may go along with anxiety or depression. So some genetic, some social, and some psychological causes. I'm going to stop here and pick up in the next one, carrying on and talking about teenagers and drugs.